So the United States will start expanding. Now, if you want to be considered a world power, you have to beat up another world power. It's playground rules or prison rules, basically. So the United States, if it's going to assert itself as a world power, it's got to come out swinging. And it went after Spain, because Spain was a weak nation and it had been getting weaker and weaker. It had once been a world power, but the United States, or it had been in a continuous state of decline. And so the United States will end up going to war with Spain over Cuba. Now, I'm not going to go into any of the details of the Spanish-American War because you have to read it in your textbook. But ultimately, what it came down to was the United States hadn't been in a foreign war since the Mexican-American War, which ended in 1848. So it had been like 50 years. And what started this was Americans' concern for the way the Spanish were treating the people of Cuba. The Spanish-American War started because the people of Cuba revolted. They had a revolution, they wanted independence, and so when that happened, the Spanish, they were incredibly aggressive, and they were what Americans would considered inhumane. And this is the primary reason for the Spanish-American War. Part of it was economic. Spain had more trade with the United States than it did with its own mother country. Cuba had more trade with the United States than it did with Spain. 90% of Cuba's exports went to the United States, and 40% of imports to Cuba were from the United States. So most of its trade was with the United States. So that was obviously a factor, but a bigger factor than that was the humanitarian aspect. Americans were indignant about the way the Spanish were treating the Cubans. Also, Americans just wanted to see Cuba independent because, like the United States, country in the Western Hemisphere or the American Hemisphere wanting to overthrow a European colonizer, Americans just wanted this. But the humanitarian aspect was especially pronounced. And what really got Americans worked up was, it's called yellow journalism. This is not at all the same as the muckrakers of the progressive era. They were hard-hitting journalists. Yellow journalism is journalism that has almost no factual basis. It is just sensational. It is basically what you get with MSNBC and Fox now. It's meant to provoke an emotion, not to make you more informed. And the two biggest yellow journalists of the time were William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. They were in competition for who could get the most readers, the most viewers, and get people the most upset. So they wrote all these sensationalist newspapers, and it really infuriated Americans. But the thing that really put it over the edge, so Americans were already upset, but this all started in Grover Cleveland, but Cleveland refused to get involved. But when William McKinley became president, he was basically forced into it. And the biggest event that led to it was the sinking of a U.S. ship. The United States had a battleship called the Maine that was in the harbor of Cuba. And it exploded. And what did the yellow journalists say? Of course, it was the fault of the Spanish. Crisis at hand, Spanish treachery, destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy, if you remember, under McKinley was Roosevelt, and he was especially adamant, we need to go to war. Roosevelt loved war. the sinking of the Maine just really infuriated Americans. Americans started saying, to hell with Spain, remember the Maine. And if it rhymes, then of course it's going to be, we love stuff that rhymes. Spain, for their part, actually, like when this happened, Spain did not want the United States to join because they knew the United States was a stronger nation. So Spain, they pretty much gave into everything the Americans wanted. And also, just so you know, the Maine was not destroyed by the Spanish. There was all these articles showing like it must have been a mine, but it was an internal explosion. And it was also an internal explosion right where all the ammunition was held. So we know now it was not the work of the Spanish. It was an internal explosion, and it probably was the fault of the captains for the way the ammunition was stored. But, you know, when Americans are in the mood for war, good luck trying to stop them. This will lead, there was so much pressure that as much as McKinley did not want war, and he did not, he was basically forced into it by all the peer pressure. In the name of humanity, in the name of civilization, in behalf of endangered American interests, which give us the right, the duty to speak and to act, the war in Cuba must stop. So he will go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war, and Congress abides because there was just such a demand for war. They did pass the Teller Amendment when something called the Teller Amendment, which said the United States will not take Cuba as a colony. So what ultimately started the Spanish-American War? Some people say it was the fault of yellow journalists for getting everyone worked up. That is not true. They were giving the American people, the yellow journalists gave the American people what they wanted, which was sensationalist news that was going to present the Spanish as being bad. There's this ridiculous tendency of Americans to be like, it's the media that is making us like this. And it's like, no. Americans find the media they want to read and listen to, and that supports their views. And that's all they were doing, really, is just giving the American people what they wanted. Some people blame Roosevelt because he really wanted the war, but fundamentally what it was is the American people. The American people wanted war. Their emotions were all whipped up, and you know, we hadn't had a war since the Civil War. And if you look at all throughout U.S. history, Americans just kind of like going to war. I'm not going to go into any of the details of the Spanish-American War because it is very short. It only lasts 4 months. Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war because it was so much fun for the United States in a lot of ways. Teddy Roosevelt, he quit the Navy Department and this is where he became the Rough Rider. And overall, I will just say, the Spanish-American War wasn't a contest of who could do better. It's a contest of who would not do the worst. And Spain their military was just terrible. It was an absolute one-sided fight. It was an overwhelmingly one-sided fight. Almost 300,000 Americans went. About 6,000 will die, and only about 380 died from combat. The rest was disease and just a ton of stupidity. And the level of stupidity on both sides was amazing. So many stupid stories, but like one of them, U.S. ships couldn't get all the way up to shore because it was too shallow for the boats to go up close. So soldiers like put on these 50-pound backpacks and were like, all right, we'll just swim to shore. You know, it's like hundreds of yards off. And they jumped in and then they sank and drowned. So a lot of people died. the whole thing was just absolutely insane. The United States will win overwhelmingly, though. And the whole thing ends with the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris did a lot of things. It ended the fighting. It gave Cuba their independence. Spain was forced to accept $400 million in Cuba's debt. Spain also had to give up its colonies, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And the United States gave Spain $20 million. Why would the United States give Spain $20 million? For the same reason the United States gave Mexico, I think it was $15 million after the Mexican-American War. After the Mexican-American War, the United States took California, Utah, Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and then we were like, here, $15 million. There you go. We didn't take it. We gave it to you. Same thing's happening here. The United States gave Spain $20 million because Spain was just destroyed. Then they got the crap end of the deal, so to speak. And they knew it. However harsh the terms of the victor may be, and as Spain lacks the material means to defend the rights she believes hers, having recorded them, she accepts the only terms the United States offers her for the concluding of the Treaty of Peace. So basically they said, we have no choice. We're going to accept this because you are forcing this on us. Now, what is really important is what is the United States going to do with those colonies? Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, what is going to happen with them? When this issue came up, what will the United States do with it? McKinley, he admitted he had no idea where the Philippines were. He had to look at a map to find Philippines. And the question is, what is the United States going to do with them? Now, obviously, the United States has several options. It could let them go free and become independent, and then what would happen? The European nations would snatch them up. It could give them back to Spain. That's not really an option. So the only other option is the United States takes them for colonies. And when I say the only option, I mean according to McKinley and McKinley administration. This would be the very first time the United States became an imperialist country. An imperialist country is a country that has colonies. And there were a lot of people that were really against it, especially, there were a lot of people that were really against it in the United States, and they actually formed an organization called the American Anti-Imperialist League. And this was an incredibly diverse group of people that said that this was absolutely against everything America stood for. It included such important people like Mark Twain. He was one of the founding members. W.E.B. Du Bois. The black activist. Andrew Carnegie funded the entire thing. Samuel Gompers, the labor leader, he was the one that organized it. It's the only time Samuel Gompers and Carnegie would work together. It even had Grover Cleveland. And they had some very good arguments. They pointed out, for one, we had just fought a war against Spain, against imperialism, and now the United States was going to become an imperialist country. Also, they said this goes against America's founding. We were founded on anti-imperialism, and now we're going to become imperialistic. And another really good argument, this is committing the United States more than 8,000 miles away. So if the United States does this, it is going to commit itself 8,000 miles away in the Philippines. What will that require? A much bigger military, a much bigger navy. I told you the history of the United States in this class is the U.S. government getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the size and scope of the military is a huge factor in all of that. It is a huge factor in all this. So ultimately, the anti-imperialists, they have some fairly good arguments, but this whole issue went to the American people in 1900. In 1900, William McKinley's running again, and if you remember, Teddy Roosevelt's running with him. The election of 1896, the issue was the gold standard versus free silver. The election of 1900, the issue was imperialism. And McKinley won, and he won overwhelmingly. This is what you call a mandate. The issue before the American people is, will the United States be an imperial country? And the American people said yes. So this is the American people getting a choice and making that decision. This is a huge reason. This is the beginning of the United States expanding all over the globe. And a big reason for the United States military continuously expanding.